GhastlyGarlic Episode 45. Ghosts of the 14th Night, an Unholy Feast. First story, Whispers of the Hollow Night. Location, a small, remote village nestled in the shadow of a towering mountain in northern Thailand. The village, unnamed in the story, is surrounded by dense forests that are said to be haunted by spirits. Chapter 1, The Midnight Wail. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, sickly glow over the village. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine, but beneath that sweetness lay something rotten, something foul. It was a night like any other, silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. But tonight, the silence was unnerving, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Lek, a young man of about 25, had always been fascinated by the stories of the Prèet. He had grown up listening to the elders warn of the hungry ghosts that roamed the earth, condemned to an eternity of insatiable hunger. His grandmother used to say that if you were unlucky enough to hear the wail of a Prèet at midnight, it meant that one was nearby, and worse, it had chosen you. Tonight, as he walked home from the village temple, Lek felt a strange chill crawl up his spine. The night seemed darker than usual, the shadows deeper. His footsteps echoed unnaturally on the dirt path, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a low, mournful wail. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. The wail grew louder, more desperate, as if something was in pain. He turned his head slowly, his eyes scanning the darkness. The forest loomed ahead, a wall of blackness that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The wail came again, closer this time, and Lek felt a wave of cold dread wash over him. Without thinking, he began to run. His feet pounded against the ground as he sprinted towards his home, the wail following him, growing louder and more frenzied. He could almost feel the icy breath of the Prèet on the back of his neck, its needle-thin mouth whispering in his ear, begging for release from its eternal torment. He burst through the door of his small wooden house, slamming it shut behind him. His chest heaved as he leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath. The wail had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Lek knew that the Prèet was still out there, watching, waiting. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The stories of the Prèet had always seemed like just that, stories. But now, they felt all too real. The memory of that wail, so full of sorrow and hunger, haunted him. He knew he had to do something, but what? Chapter 2, The Forbidden Ritual. The village was small, and news traveled fast. By morning, everyone knew about Lek's encounter. The elders gathered in the village square, their faces grim. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices heavy with fear and concern. The village headman, an old man with deep lines etched into his face, approached Lek. "You've heard the wail of the Prèet," he said, his voice low. "This is a bad omen. The Prèet is drawn to those who are weak of spirit, those who are easily tempted by greed or jealousy. Have you done something to attract its attention?" Lek shook his head. "No, I haven't. I don't know why it came after me." The headman narrowed his eyes. "There is a way to rid yourself of the Prèet, but it is dangerous. The ritual must be performed at the stroke of midnight, at the place where you first heard the wail. But be warned, if the ritual fails, the Prèet will consume your soul." Lek's heart sank. He didn't want to face the Prèet again, but he knew he had no choice. The thought of living with the constant fear of that wail, of the Prèet's insatiable hunger, was unbearable. That night, Lek prepared for the ritual. He gathered the items the headman had instructed him to: a small bowl of rice, a lit candle, and a knife. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, he felt a sense of impending doom settle over him. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows in his room seemed to writhe and twist, as if alive. At the stroke of midnight, Lek left his house and walked towards the forest. The path was dark, but the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting eerie, shifting shadows on the ground. The wail came again, louder this time, and Lek's hands trembled as he clutched the bowl of rice. He reached the spot where he had first heard the wail and knelt down, placing the bowl of rice on the ground. The air was freezing, and his breath came out in white puffs. The wail grew louder, more desperate, and Lek could feel the presence of the Prèet looming over him, its massive, hollow form just out of sight. With trembling hands, Lek lit the candle and placed it beside the rice. The flame flickered wildly, as if trying to resist the darkness that surrounded it. He picked up the knife and made a small cut on his finger, letting a few drops of blood fall into the rice. The wail reached a fever pitch, a chorus of agony that echoed through the trees. Lek's heart pounded in his chest as he recited the incantation the headman had taught him. His voice shook, but he forced himself to continue, his eyes squeezed shut. As he finished the incantation, the wail abruptly stopped. The silence was deafening, and Lek slowly opened his eyes. The Prèet was standing before him, its skeletal form towering over him. Its hollow eyes stared down at the bowl of rice, its needle-thin mouth opening and closing hungrily. Without warning, the Prèet lunged at the bowl, devouring the rice in a single gulp. The candle flickered and died, plunging the forest into darkness. Lek felt a rush of cold air as the Prèet disappeared, leaving him alone in the silence. He remained kneeling on the ground, his heart pounding in his chest. The ritual had worked, but the encounter had left him shaken. He knew the Prèet was gone, but the memory of its hollow eyes and the sound of its wail would haunt him forever. Chapter 3: The Endless Hunger. Days passed, and the village returned to its normal routine. But Lek was changed. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the Prèet's hunger had somehow latched onto him. He began to eat more, shoveling food into his mouth with a desperation he had never felt before. No matter how much he ate, he was never satisfied. His stomach ached with hunger, but his mouth remained dry, as if he had swallowed sand. The villagers noticed the change in Lek. He grew thinner, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He stopped speaking to others, withdrawing into himself. The hunger consumed him, and he spent his days searching for food, scavenging the forest for anything edible. One night, as he wandered through the village, he heard the wail again. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but it was enough to send a chill down his spine. He followed the sound, his heart racing. The wail grew louder as he approached the temple, and Lek knew that the Prèet had returned. He entered the temple, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. The wail filled the air, a haunting melody that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Lek fell to his knees before the altar, his hands trembling. The Prèet appeared before him, its skeletal form more emaciated than before. Its hollow eyes stared at him, filled with a hunger that mirrored his own. Lek knew that the ritual had failed, that the Prèet had not been satisfied. Its hunger had only grown, and now it was bound to him, feeding off his own insatiable appetite. With a trembling hand, Lek reached out to the Prèet, offering it the last of his food. The Prèet lunged at the offering, devouring it in an instant. But it was not enough. The Prèet's hunger was endless, and so was Lek's. They were bound together in a cycle of hunger and despair, never to be satisfied. As the first light of dawn filtered through the temple's windows, Lek realized that he would never escape the Prèet. The wail echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the endless hunger that consumed him. He knew that he would never find peace, that his soul was forever bound to the Prèet's insatiable desire. And so, Lek remained in the village, a shadow of his former self. The villagers whispered about the young man, who had been cursed by the Prèet, his life consumed by a hunger that could never be satisfied. And as the nights grew longer, and the wail of the Prèet echoed through the village, they knew that the curse was spreading, that the Prèet's hunger would never be quenched. Chapter 4: The Village's Curse. Weeks turned into months, and Lek's condition worsened. His once strong and agile body had withered away, leaving behind a frail, skeletal figure that barely resembled the man he once was. His eyes, once full of life, were now sunken and hollow, filled with a desperate, all-consuming hunger. The villagers avoided him, fearful of the curse that had befallen him. But Lek was not the only one who suffered. The wail of the Prèet began to echo through the village more frequently, growing louder and more insistent with each passing night. The villagers began to experience strange, unexplainable phenomena. Food would rot overnight, turning to dust in their hands. The crops in the fields withered, and the animals became sickly and died without reason. The village was slowly being consumed by the same hunger that had taken hold of Lek. The elders gathered once more, their faces etched with fear and despair. They knew that the curse of the Prèet had spread beyond Lek, infecting the entire village. The headman, his voice trembling, addressed the crowd. The Prèet's hunger knows no bounds. It has latched onto our village, and it will not stop until we are all consumed. We must find a way to break the curse, or we will all suffer the same fate as Lek. The villagers murmured in agreement, but no one knew how to stop the Prèet. The headman turned to the village monk, a wise and respected figure, who had dedicated his life to the teachings of Buddhism. "Venerable sir, is there nothing we can do to rid ourselves of this curse?" The monk closed his eyes, deep in thought. After a long silence, he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "There is one way, but it is a path fraught with danger. The Prèet is a soul tormented by its own karma, bound to this world by its insatiable desires. To break the curse, we must confront the source of that karma and offer it release. This requires a journey to the place where the Prèet's soul was first bound to this world, a place of great darkness and sorrow." The villagers listened in silence, their fear palpable. The monk continued, "I will go with Lek to this place and perform the ritual to release the Prèet's soul. But know this, if we fail, the curse will only grow stronger, and it will consume us all." Chapter 5. The Journey into Darkness. The next day, Lek and the monk set out on their journey. The villagers watched in silence as they disappeared into the forest, their hearts heavy with fear and hope. The path was treacherous, winding through dense thickets and over jagged rocks. The air grew colder the deeper they went, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching out like skeletal hands. After hours of walking, they arrived at a clearing deep within the forest. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground was littered with bones, both human and animal. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient, crumbling shrine, its stone walls covered in moss and vines. This was the place where the Prèet's soul had been bound, a place of great suffering and death. The monk approached the shrine, his expression grave. "This is where the ritual must be performed," he said, turning to Lek. "But you must be prepared. The Prèet's hunger is strong, and it will try to stop us. You must resist its pull, or we will both be lost." Lek nodded, though fear gnawed at his insides. He could feel the Prèet's presence all around them, a dark, oppressive force that weighed down on his soul. The monk began to chant, his voice steady and calm, reciting the sacred incantations needed to release the Prèet's soul. As the monk chanted, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The air grew colder, and a low, guttural wail echoed through the clearing. Lek felt the pull of the Prèet's hunger, a gnawing, insatiable desire that clawed at his mind, urging him to give in, to let go of his resistance, and allow the hunger to consume him. But Lek fought back, clinging to the memory of who he once was. He could feel the Prèet's presence growing stronger, its skeletal form materializing before him. The Prèet's hollow eyes stared into his soul, its mouth opening in a silent scream of hunger and despair. The monk's chanting grew louder, more urgent, as the Prèet advanced towards Lek. The air crackled with energy, and the ground shook violently. Lek could feel the Prèet's hunger pulling at him, trying to drag him into the darkness. But he held on, focusing on the monk's voice, on the hope that they could end this curse. Suddenly, the Prèet let out a deafening wail, its form dissolving into a swirl of black smoke that surrounded Lek. The smoke tightened around him, squeezing the air from his lungs, crushing him with the weight of the Prèet's endless hunger. Lek's vision blurred, and he felt himself slipping away, the darkness closing in. But just as he was about to succumb, the monk's voice cut through the haze, clear and powerful. "Lek, you must resist. Remember who you are. Do not let the Prèet take you." With a final surge of strength, Lek pushed back against the darkness, forcing the Prèet's presence from his mind. The smoke dissipated, and the Prèet's wail faded into silence. The ground stopped trembling, and the air grew still. The monk finished the ritual, his voice calm and steady once more. The shrine glowed faintly, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the clearing began to lift. The Prèet's presence was gone, and with it, the curse that had plagued the village. But as Lek looked around the clearing, he felt no relief, only a deep, gnawing emptiness. The hunger was still there, deep within him, a void that could never be filled. The Prèet may have been released, but its curse had left a permanent mark on his soul. Chapter 6. The Haunting of the Forsaken. Lek and the monk returned to the village, where they were greeted with cheers and relief. The curse had been lifted, the villagers' crops began to grow again, the animals recovered, and the eerie phenomena ceased. The village returned to its peaceful routine, and the stories of the Prèet became just another tale whispered by the fireside. But Lek was not the same. Though the Prèet was gone, the hunger remained, an ever-present gnawing in his gut. It was quieter now, no longer the all-consuming force it had once been, but it was still there, lurking in the shadows of his mind. He tried to live a normal life, but the emptiness haunted him, a constant reminder of the curse that had bound him to the Prèet. The villagers noticed the change in Lek. He became withdrawn, avoiding the company of others. His once strong and cheerful demeanor had faded into a shadow of its former self. Some whispered that he was still cursed, that the Prèet had left a part of itself within him. Others said that Lek had simply seen too much, that the horrors he had faced had broken something inside him. Lek knew the truth, but he kept it to himself. The Prèet had left its mark on him, a hunger that could never be satisfied. He spent his days in quiet solitude, wandering the outskirts of the village, searching for something, anything, that could fill the void within him. One night, as the moon hung low in the sky, Lek heard the wail again. It was faint, almost like a distant echo, but it sent a chill down his spine. He knew that the Prèet was gone, that its soul had been released, but the hunger it had left behind still lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. He followed the sound, his heart heavy with dread. The wail grew louder as he approached the edge of the forest, and Lek knew that the curse had not been broken, only transferred. The Prèet's hunger had become his own, and now it was calling to him, urging him to succumb. As he entered the forest, the trees seemed to close in around him, their branches twisting and writhing like skeletal fingers. The wail echoed through the darkness, a mournful cry that resonated deep within Lek's soul. He knew that he could not escape the hunger, that it would haunt him for the rest of his days. The villagers never saw Lek again. Some say that he was taken by the Prèet, his soul consumed by its endless hunger. Others believe that he simply wandered into the forest and never returned, lost to the darkness that had claimed him. But on certain nights, when the moon is high and the air is still, the villagers swear they can hear the wail of the Prèet echoing through the trees. And they know that the curse is still out there, waiting, hungry, and that one day it will return to claim another soul, ending the unbroken chain. The tale of Lek and the Prèet became a legend in the village, a story told to warn future generations of the dangers of greed and insatiable desire. But the truth was far more terrifying than any story could convey. The curse of the Prèet had not been broken, it had simply found a new vessel. And as long as that hunger existed, the Prèet would never truly be gone. For in the end, the Prèet was not just a spirit bound by its own karma, it was a manifestation of the darkest desires that lurk within all of us. And as long as those desires remained, the Prèet would continue to haunt the living, feeding on their fears, their weaknesses, and their insatiable hunger. And so, the cycle continued, unbroken, as the wail of the Prèet echoed through the hollow night, a reminder that some curses can never be lifted, and some hungers can never be satisfied. The end of the first story. Second story, The Tongue of the Hungry Ghosts. Chapter 1, A City of Spirits. Hong Kong, a bustling metropolis that never sleeps, is a city where the old meets the new, where ancient traditions coexist with modern life. Amidst the neon lights and towering skyscrapers, there are stories of things that lurk in the shadows, of spirits that roam the streets, and of curses that have plagued the city for generations. Ka Yang, a young journalist with a penchant for uncovering the truth behind urban legends, had always been fascinated by these stories. She had grown up hearing tales of the Hungry Ghost Festival, a time when the gates of the underworld were said to open, allowing spirits to roam the earth in search of offerings to satisfy their unending hunger. But Ka Yang was not one to believe in superstitions. She had always been skeptical, dismissing the stories as mere folklore, created to keep children in line and to explain the unexplainable. However, her curiosity often got the better of her, leading her to investigate the origins of these tales, searching for the truth hidden within the myths. It was during one such investigation that she stumbled upon a story that would change her life forever. A story of a haunted roast meat shop in the heart of Hong Kong, where spirits were said to gather during the Hungry Ghost Festival, drawn by the scent of roasted meat. The story had been popularized by a local musician, famous for his claims of seeing spirits, and it had captivated the public's imagination. Intrigued, Ka Yang decided to dig deeper, hoping to uncover the truth behind the legend. Little did she know that her search for answers would lead her into a world of darkness and terror, where the line between the living and the dead was blurred, and where the hungry ghosts were more than just a story, they were real. Chapter 2, The Haunted Roast Meat Shop. The shop was tucked away in a narrow alley, hidden from the main streets and far from the prying eyes of tourists. It was a small, unassuming place, with a faded sign hanging above the entrance and a few red lanterns swaying gently in the breeze. The smell of roasted meat wafted through the air, mingling with the scent of incense from a nearby temple. Yang stood outside the shop, her notebook in hand, observing the scene. It was the middle of the Hungry Ghost Festival, and the streets were alive with activity. Offerings of food and incense were placed outside homes and businesses, and the sound of chanting filled the air as people prayed for the spirits of their ancestors. But the shop was eerily quiet. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of the usual bustling activity that accompanied such establishments. It was as if the shop had been forgotten, left to decay in the shadow of the city's towering buildings. Yang pushed open the door and stepped inside, the smell of roasted meat hitting her like a wave. The interior was dimly lit, with only a few flickering candles providing light. The walls were lined with slabs of roasted meat, hanging from hooks like morbid decorations. She approached the counter, where an elderly man stood, his face hidden in the shadows. He looked up as she approached, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. "I'm a journalist," Yang replied, holding up her notebook. "I'm investigating the stories about this place, about the spirits that are said to haunt it during the Hungry Ghost Festival." The man's expression darkened, and he glanced nervously around the shop. "There are no spirits here," he said, his voice low. "It's just a story, nothing more." Yang wasn't convinced. "People say they've seen ghosts here, licking the roasted meat with long tongues," she pressed. "Is it true?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know anything about that," he said, turning away. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." But Yang wasn't ready to give up. She had come too far to turn back now. "Please," she said, her voice softening, "I just want to know the truth. If there's something you're afraid of, I can help." The man froze, his back to her, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, he turned around, his face pale and drawn. "You want the truth?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Then you should leave this place and never come back. Some things are better left alone." Yang felt a chill run down her spine, but she stood her ground. "I'm not leaving until I get answers," she said firmly. The man stared at her for a long moment, then sighed, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "Very well," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But don't say I didn't warn you." He gestured for her to follow him, leading her to a small door at the back of the shop. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. Yang hesitated, but her curiosity got the better of her. She followed the man down the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest. The air grew colder as they descended, and the smell of roasted meat faded, replaced by a musty, damp odor. At the bottom of the stairs, they entered a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old, dusty jars, and in the center of the room stood a large, ornate altar, covered in offerings of food, incense, and paper money. The man approached the altar and lit a stick of incense, bowing his head in prayer. Yang watched in silence, her mind racing. What was this place, and why had he brought her here? After a moment, the man turned to her, his expression grim. "This is where it all began," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "The spirits you seek, those who lick the roasted meat with their long tongues, they are the souls of those who were wronged, those who died with a hunger that could never be satisfied." Yang's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean?" she asked. The man sighed and began to tell his story. A story of betrayal, greed, and vengeance, of a family torn apart by tragedy, and of a curse that had plagued this place for decades. Chapter 3: The Curse of the Hungry Ghosts. The story began many years ago, when the shop was run by a wealthy family known for their delicious roasted meats. Business was booming, and the family prospered, but their success came at a cost. The owner, a man named Mr. Chan, was a ruthless businessman who cared little for the well-being of his workers. He paid them meager wages, forced them to work long hours in terrible conditions, and threatened them with violence if they dared to complain. Among his workers was a young woman named Mei Ling, who had come to the city in search of a better life. She was a hard worker, dedicated and loyal, but Mr. Chan took advantage of her kindness, exploiting her for his own gain. Mei Ling was promised a better position, better pay, but it never came. Instead, She was worked to the bone, her health deteriorating as she struggled to keep up with the demands of the job. One day, Mei Ling collapsed from exhaustion, and Mr. Chan, fearing the loss of his best worker, refused to let her rest. He forced her to continue working, ignoring her pleas for help. Mei Ling's condition worsened, and she eventually succumbed to her illness, dying in the very shop where she had worked so tirelessly. But Mei Ling's spirit did not rest. She returned as a hungry ghost, driven by the unfulfilled hunger that had consumed her in life. She was joined by others who had suffered similar fates at the hands of Mr. Chan, workers who had been overworked, underpaid, and left to die without a second thought. The spirits began to haunt the shop, drawn by the scent of the roasted meat they had been denied in life. They would appear at night, licking the meat with their long, ghostly tongues, trying to satisfy the hunger that had followed them into death. Mr. Chan was tormented by the spirits, unable to escape their wrath. He tried to appease them with offerings, but it was never enough. The hunger of the ghosts was insatiable, and they continued to haunt the shop, driving away customers and leaving the business in ruins. Desperate, Mr. Chan sought the help of a Taoist priest, who advised him to build an altar and make regular offerings to the spirits. Mr. Chan did as he was told, and for a time, the hauntings ceased. But the curse was far from broken. The spirits remained, bound to the shop by their unfulfilled desires, and the curse was passed down from generation to generation, each new owner suffering the same fate. The man finished his story, his voice heavy with regret. "I am the last of the Chan family," he said. "I inherited this shop and the curse that comes with it. I have tried to keep the spirits at bay, but their hunger is too great. They cannot be satisfied, no matter how much I offer them." Ka Yang felt a chill run down her spine. She had come here looking for a story, but what she had found was far more than she had bargained for. The curse was real, and the spirits were still here, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next victim. Chapter 4: A Taste of Terror. Ka Yang couldn't shake the feeling of unease as she left the shop that night. The story the man had told her haunted her thoughts, and she couldn't help but wonder if the spirits were watching her even now, their ghostly tongues licking the air, tasting the fear that lingered in the back of her mind. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Ka Yang decided to stay in the area for a few days, hoping to witness the haunting for herself. She rented a small room in a nearby guest house, where she could keep an eye on the shop without drawing too much attention to herself. The nights were long and restless, filled with strange noises and eerie whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Ka Yang found herself waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with tension, and she could feel the presence of something unseen, watching her from the shadows. On the third night, as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, a faint, wet slurping noise, like someone licking their lips in the dark. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the room, echoing off the walls and reverberating in her ears. Ka Yang sat up in bed, her heart racing. The noise was coming from outside her window, and she could see a faint light flickering in the alley below. She grabbed her camera and cautiously approached the window, peering out into the darkness. What she saw made her gasp in horror. There, in the dim light of the alley, were two figures, a mother and her young daughter, both dressed in tattered, old-fashioned clothing. Their faces were pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and sunken, and their tongues, their tongues, were impossibly long, stretching out from their mouths like writhing snakes. The mother and daughter were licking the slabs of roasted meat hanging outside the shop, their tongues sliding over the glistening surface, savoring the essence that had seeped into the meat. Ka Yang watched in horror, as the meat seemed to dissolve under their tongues, leaving nothing behind but a trail of slime. She fumbled with her camera, trying to capture the scene, but her hands were shaking too much to get a clear shot. The figures continued their ghastly feast, oblivious to her presence, their tongues flicking out like serpents, tasting the air. Ka Yang's breath caught in her throat as the mother turned her head, her hollow eyes locking onto Ka Yang's. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, and Ka Yang felt a wave of terror wash over her, paralyzing her in place. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures vanished, melting into the shadows like smoke. The alley was silent once more, the only sound the distant hum of the city. Ka Yang collapsed onto her bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seen them, the ghosts, the hungry spirits that haunted the shop, and they had seen her too. Chapter 5, The Feast of the Damned. The next day, Yang couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. She knew she had to return to the shop, to confront the man and demand answers, but the thought of going back there filled her with fear. But Yang was not one to back down from a challenge. She steeled herself and made her way back to the shop, her mind racing with questions. What had she seen? Were the spirits real? And if so, what did they want? The shop was as quiet as ever, the smell of roasted meat lingering in the air. Yang pushed open the door and stepped inside, her eyes scanning the dimly lit interior. The man was nowhere to be seen, and the shop was empty, save for the slabs of meat hanging from the hooks. She approached the counter and called out, but there was no response. The silence was oppressive, and Yang felt a growing sense of unease. Something was wrong. She walked to the back of the shop, to the door that led to the stairs, but it was locked. She knocked, but there was no answer. Panic began to set in as she realized that she was alone. Suddenly, the door behind her creaked open, and Yang spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. But it was only the man, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with fear. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice trembling. Yang swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw them," she said. "The ghosts? They were licking the meat." The man's expression darkened, and he nodded slowly. "They are hungry," he said. "They always will be." Yang felt a shiver run down her spine. "What do they want?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "They want what they were denied in life," he said. "They want to eat, but their hunger can never be satisfied. They are cursed to roam the earth, searching for food that they can never truly taste." Yang's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. "Is there any way to stop them?" she asked. The man shook his head. "The curse is too strong," he said. "It has been passed down through generations. The only way to break it would be to destroy the shop, to burn it to the ground. But even then, I fear the spirits would find a new place to haunt." Yang felt a wave of hopelessness wash over her. The curse was unbreakable, and the spirits were doomed to wander forever, their hunger never sated. But she couldn't just walk away. She had to do something. "I want to help," she said, her voice firm. "There has to be a way to put their spirits to rest." The man stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "There may be one way," he said, "but it is dangerous." Yang leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Tell me." The man took a deep breath and began to explain. "The spirits are drawn to the meat because it is a reminder of what they were denied in life," he said. "If we can make an offering of food that they can truly consume, it might be enough to put their spirits to rest." Yang frowned. "But how can they eat if they have no physical bodies?" The man hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, ornate box. He opened it to reveal a piece of paper, covered in intricate symbols. "This is a talisman," he said. "It has the power to allow spirits to consume food, to taste it as they did in life. But it is dangerous. If the spirits consume too much, they could become more powerful, more dangerous." Yang's heart skipped a beat. "And what if it doesn't work?" The man's expression was grim. "Then the curse will continue, and the spirits will become even more ravenous. They will not stop until they have consumed everything in their path." Yang swallowed hard, her mind racing. This was her chance to end the curse, to put the spirits to rest. But it was also a risk that could cost her everything. But Yang was not one to back down. She took the talisman from the man's hand, her resolve firm. "I'll do it," she said. "Tell me what I need to do." Chapter 6, The Final Offering. The night was dark and oppressive as Yang prepared for the ritual. The man had instructed her on what to do, and she had spent the day gathering the necessary items, food, incense, and the talisman that would allow the spirits to consume the offering. She set up the altar in the back room of the shop, placing the food on the table and lighting the incense. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meat, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the walls. Yang's heart raced as she recited the incantation the man had taught her, holding the talisman over the food. The symbols on the paper began to glow, and the air around her seemed to grow colder, as if the spirits were drawing near. Suddenly, the room was filled with a low, guttural growling noise, and Yang felt a presence behind her. She turned to see the figures of the mother and daughter, their ghostly forms shimmering in the darkness, their long tongues flicking out as they approached the altar. Yang swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she held out the talisman. "Take this offering," she said, her voice shaking, "and may your spirits find peace." The spirits hesitated, then slowly reached out, their tongues wrapping around the food. Yang watched in horror as they devoured the offering, their tongues moving with inhuman speed, consuming everything in their path. But as the spirits ate, Yang noticed something strange. The more they consumed, the more solid they became, their ghostly forms taking on a more human appearance. Their eyes glowed with an eerie light, and their tongues seemed to grow longer, more grotesque. Yang's heart raced as she realized the danger. The talisman was working, but it was also making the spirits more powerful, more dangerous. She had to stop them before it was too late. But it was too late. The spirits turned their glowing eyes on Yang, their tongues flicking out like serpents. She backed away, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way to stop them. But there was no time. The spirits lunged at her, their tongues wrapping around her neck, choking the life out of her. Yang gasped for breath, her vision growing dim as she struggled to free herself. But the spirits were too strong, their hunger too great. As she felt herself slipping away, Yang's last thought was of the man, the one who had told her the story of the curse. He had known the danger, but he had sent her into the trap anyway. And now, she was just another victim of the curse, another soul lost to the hunger of the spirits. The shop was silent once more, the only sound the faint flicker of candlelight, as it cast eerie shadows on the walls. The spirits were gone, their hunger temporarily sated, but the curse remained. And it would continue, as long as there were souls to feed their insatiable appetite. The end of the second story. Third story, The Feast of Forgotten Souls. Chapter 1, The Unseen Guests. The humid air of Hong Kong was thick with anticipation, as the city prepared for the annual Hungry Ghost Festival. Streets were adorned with paper lanterns, and makeshift altars lined the corners, laden with offerings of food, incense, and joss paper. The pungent scent of burning offerings mixed with the humid air, creating an atmosphere both festive and eerie. In a small, dimly lit apartment in the heart of the city, Mingwei, a young journalist, sat at her desk, her eyes scanning the notes she had gathered for her next article. She was determined to write a piece that would stand out, something that delved deeper into the cultural practices of the festival. As she read through the stories and superstitions surrounding the Hungry Ghost Festival, one tale in particular caught her attention. It was an old belief that had fallen out of favor in recent years, a warning against offering lavish foods to the hungry ghosts. Traditionally, offerings of bean sprouts, tofu, and longan, foods with high water content, were made to these spirits out of kindness, so they could consume a little before it turned to ash in their mouths. But as the years passed, many had begun to confuse these offerings with those made to honor ancestors, laying out grand feasts that attracted not just the benevolent spirits, but also those with darker intentions. Intrigued by the potential consequences of such a mistake, Mingwei decided to dig deeper. She had heard rumors of people who had experienced strange occurrences after the festival, stories that were often dismissed as mere superstition. But something about the way these tales were told, the fear in the voices of those who shared them, made her believe there was more to the festival than met the eye. As she continued her research, Mingwei stumbled upon a particularly chilling account. It was an old, forgotten newspaper article from the 1980s, detailing a family who had vanished without a trace shortly after the Hungry Ghost Festival. The article mentioned that the family had made an unusually lavish offering that year, much to the envy of their neighbors. The story sent a shiver down Mingwei's spine. Could there be a connection between the lavish offerings and the family's disappearance? Determined to find out more, she made a note to visit the area where the family had lived, hoping to uncover any lingering traces of the mystery. Chapter 2, The Forgotten Alley. The next day, Mingwei found herself standing in front of an old, crumbling building in one of Hong Kong's older districts. The area had seen better days, with many of the shops and residences boarded up or abandoned. The building where the missing family had once lived was no exception. Its windows were broken, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Mingwei hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The inside was dark and musty, the air thick with dust and decay. She pulled out a flashlight and began to explore, her footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. As she made her way through the building, she noticed that the interior had been left largely untouched since the family had disappeared. Faded photographs still hung on the walls, and a layer of dust covered the furniture. It was as if time had stopped in this forgotten place, the lives of its former occupants frozen in time. Mingwei's heart raced as she entered the kitchen, where the remnants of the last meal the family had prepared still lingered. Plates and bowls were scattered across the table, the food long since rotted away. But what caught her attention was a small altar in the corner, its candles burned down to stubs. The offerings had long since turned to dust, but the faint smell of incense still lingered in the air. She carefully approached the altar, her eyes scanning the offerings. There were the traditional items, bean sprouts, tofu, longan, but there were also more lavish foods, items that would not typically be offered to the hungry ghosts. Mingwei felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the significance of what she was seeing. The family had made the mistake of offering these foods to the wrong spirits, and they had paid the price. As she stood there, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the last of the candles. Mingwei jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. She quickly made her way out of the building, her mind racing with what she had discovered. But as she stepped outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around nervously, but the street was empty. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the building she had just left. Mingwei hurried back to her apartment, eager to put some distance between herself and the old building. But as she closed the door behind her, she couldn't help but feel that she had brought something back with her, something dark and malevolent that now lingered in the shadows of her home. Chapter 3: The Haunting Begins. That night, Mingwei found it difficult to sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw images of the old building and the forgotten altar. She tossed and turned, her mind replaying the events of the day over and over again. Just as she was about to drift off, a strange sound jolted her awake. It was a soft, rustling noise, like the sound of paper being crumpled. Mingwei sat up in bed, her heart racing as she listened intently. The noise seemed to be coming from the living room. She hesitated for a moment before getting out of bed and slowly making her way towards the source of the sound. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the city outside. As she entered the living room, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The notes she had been working on earlier were scattered across the floor, as if someone had rifled through them. But there was no one else in the apartment. Mingwei's hands trembled as she gathered the papers, her mind racing with fear and confusion. Suddenly, the rustling noise returned, louder this time, and Mingwei realized it was coming from the small altar she had set up in the corner of the room, a simple offering she had made in honor of the festival. The incense she had lit earlier had burned out, but the paper money she had left as an offering was now moving on its own, as if being disturbed by an unseen force. Mingwei backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to convince herself that it was just a draft, but deep down, she knew there was something more sinister at play. The stories she had heard about the hungry ghosts, the warnings about offering them too much, she was beginning to believe they were true. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences in her apartment only grew more frequent. Objects would move on their own, doors would open and close by themselves, and at night, she would hear the faint sound of whispering voices, as if the spirits were talking to each other just beyond her reach. Mingwei became increasingly paranoid, her once rational mind consumed by fear. She barely slept, her thoughts plagued by the idea that she had somehow angered the spirits. She began to see shadows moving out of the corner of her eye, and every time she turned to look, there was nothing there. Desperate for answers, Mingwei decided to consult a local spiritualist, someone who might be able to help her understand what was happening. She was skeptical, but at this point, she was willing to try anything to rid herself of the haunting presence in her home. Chapter 4: The Spiritualist's Warning. Mingwei made her way to a small, unassuming shop tucked away in one of the narrow alleys of the city. The sign above the door was faded, and the windows were covered with thick curtains, giving the place an air of secrecy. She hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The shop was dimly lit, filled with the scent of incense and the soft sound of chimes tinkling in the background. Shelves lined the walls, filled with various charms, talismans, and other spiritual items. At the back of the shop, an elderly woman sat behind a small table. Her eyes closed as she muttered a prayer under her breath. Mingwei approached the woman cautiously, unsure of what to expect. The woman opened her eyes and looked up, her gaze piercing and intense. "You seek answers," the woman said, her voice low and raspy. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Mingwei nodded, her throat dry. "Yes," she said, "I think I've angered some spirits. They won't leave me alone." The woman studied her for a moment, then gestured for Mingwei to sit. "Tell me what happened," she said. Mingwei recounted her experiences, from the old building to the strange occurrences in her apartment. The woman listened intently, her expression growing more serious as the story went on. When Mingwei finished, the woman sat in silence for a moment, as if contemplating what to say next. Finally, she spoke. "You have made a grave mistake," she said. "The offerings you saw in that building, they were not meant for the ancestors. They were meant for the hungry ghosts. And by entering that place, by disturbing the altar, you have invited them into your life." Mingwei felt a wave of dread wash over her. "Is there any way to get rid of them?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman nodded slowly. "There is a way, but it is not easy," she said. "You must make amends. You must offer them what they truly desire, watery food, something they can consume before it turns to ash. And you must do so with sincerity, for they can sense deceit." Mingwei felt a glimmer of hope. "I can do that," she said. "But how do I know they'll leave me alone after that?" The woman shook her head. "There are no guarantees," she said. "The spirits are unpredictable. They may accept your offering, or they may not. But it is your only chance." Mingwei thanked the woman and left the shop, her mind racing with the information she had just received. She knew what she had to do, but the thought of facing the spirits again filled her with fear. Still, she had no choice. If she wanted to rid herself of the haunting presence, she had to make the offering. Chapter 5: The Final Offering. That night, Mingwei prepared the offering as the spiritualist had instructed. She gathered the traditional items, bean sprouts, tofu, longan, and placed them carefully on the altar in her living room. She lit the incense and sat down in front of the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. As the incense smoke curled into the air, Mingwei closed her eyes and began to speak softly, addressing the spirits she believed were now present in the room. "I offer this food to you," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, accept it and leave me in peace." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the room grew cold, and Mingwei felt a presence behind her, as if something was watching her every move. She kept her eyes closed, too terrified to look. Suddenly, she heard a faint, whispering voice, followed by the sound of something moving across the floor. Mingwei opened her eyes just in time to see the food on the altar begin to wither and turn to ash, as if consumed by an unseen force. Her heart raced as she watched the scene unfold, the eerie silence broken only by the faint sound of chewing. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, and Mingwei felt the air grow thick with tension. Finally, the whispering stopped, and the room returned to its normal temperature. The food on the altar was gone, reduced to a pile of ash. Mingwei let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her, as she realized the spirits had accepted her offering. But as she stood up to leave, a sudden chill ran down her spine. She turned around slowly, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of the spirits. But there was nothing, just the faint glow of the incense and the flickering candlelight. Mingwei sighed in relief and made her way to her bedroom, exhausted from the night's events. But as she lay down to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. The shadows seemed to loom larger than before, and the air was thick with a sense of unease. Just as she was about to drift off to sleep, she heard a faint sound coming from the living room, the rustling of paper, the same sound that had woken her up nights before. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized the spirits had not left. They were still there, waiting, watching. Mingwei sat up in bed, her mind racing with fear. She had done everything the spiritualist had told her to do. Why were the spirits still haunting her? Suddenly, the whispering voices returned, louder this time, echoing through the apartment like a sinister chant. Mingwei covered her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The spirits were angry, their hunger still unsatisfied. As the voices grew louder, Mingwei felt a crushing sense of dread. She realized with horror that the offering had only made things worse. The spirits were not appeased, they were enraged. In the darkness, she saw the shadows shift, taking on the shape of twisted figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. The spirits had come to claim her, and there was no escaping their wrath. Mingwei's screams echoed through the apartment, but no one was there to hear her. The city outside continued on, oblivious to the terror that unfolded within those walls. By the time the sun rose, the apartment was silent once more, the only sign of the night's events a faint trail of ash leading to the altar. Mingwei was gone, her fate sealed by the very spirits she had tried to appease. And as the city prepared for another night of the Hungry Ghost Festival, the spirits remained, their hunger insatiable, their presence a constant reminder of the dangers that lurked just beyond the veil of the living. The end of the third story. Fourth story, The Shadow of the 14th Night. Chapter 1, The Unseen Presence. In the heart of China, nestled between mountains and rivers, lies a village untouched by the relentless march of time. The villagers adhere to ancient traditions, their lives dictated by rituals passed down through generations. The most sacred of these is the Hungry Ghost Festival, a time when the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. For centuries, the festival has been marked by the lighting of lanterns, the burning of incense, and the offering of food to appease the spirits that return to the world of the living. But in recent years, strange occurrences have begun to plague the village. Unexplained accidents, sudden illnesses, and whispers of dark shadows moving in the night have sown fear among the villagers. They speak in hushed tones of a curse, of angry spirits seeking revenge. And as the 14th night of the 7th lunar month approaches, the air grows thick with tension and dread. This year, the festival will be different. This year, the darkness that has been lurking in the shadows will come to light, and the village will be forced to confront the secrets it has buried for so long. The festival preparations were in full swing as the village buzzed with activity. Children ran through the streets, their laughter echoing off the ancient stone walls, while the elders gathered to oversee the construction of the altar. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the sound of chanting, as the villagers prepared to welcome the spirits of their ancestors. Yet, beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent of unease. For weeks, strange things had been happening in the village. People spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of footsteps echoing through empty rooms, and of cold winds that swept through the village in the dead of night. The villagers were afraid, though they dared not speak of it openly. Ling, a young woman who had recently returned to the village after many years in the city, was among those who sensed the growing darkness. She had come back to care for her ailing grandmother, but from the moment she arrived, she had felt a cold presence lingering in the air. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, but as the days passed, the feeling grew stronger. One night, as Ling was preparing to go to bed, she heard a noise outside her window. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet through the dirt. She peered out into the darkness, but saw nothing. Just as she was about to turn away, a figure appeared in the distance, barely visible in the dim light. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, but there was something off about him. His movements were jerky, unnatural, and as he drew closer, Ling saw that his eyes were hollow, empty voids. She stumbled back, her heart racing, and when she looked again, the figure was gone. But the sense of dread remained, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. She tried to tell herself that it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, she knew that something was terribly wrong. Chapter 2, The Ritual. As the 14th night of the 7th lunar month approached, the villagers grew more anxious. The incidents of strange occurrences increased, and the fear that had been simmering beneath the surface now threatened to boil over. The elders, desperate to appease the spirits and protect the village, decided to perform an ancient ritual that had not been conducted in years. The ritual was meant to cleanse the village of any malevolent spirits and ensure the safe passage of the ancestors' souls back to the afterlife. It involved the sacrifice of animals, the burning of offerings, and a night-long vigil by the temple's high priest. The villagers gathered at the temple, their faces solemn as they watched the preparations. Ling was there too, though she felt a growing sense of unease. Her grandmother, who had always been a source of comfort and wisdom, had fallen into a deep sleep from which she could not be roused. Ling had tried everything to wake her, but it was as if her grandmother was in a trance, lost in a world of her own. The ritual began at midnight, under the light of the full moon. The high priest chanted ancient incantations as the villagers bowed their heads in prayer. The air was thick with the smell of burning incense, and the crackle of the fire filled the silence of the night. But as the ritual reached its climax, something went wrong. The fire, which had been burning steadily, suddenly roared to life, its flames leaping high into the sky. The villagers gasped in shock as the fire spread, consuming the altar and the offerings. The high priest's chanting faltered, and he staggered back, his eyes wide with fear. And then, from the flames, a figure emerged. It was the same figure Ling had seen that night outside her window, but now it was clear that this was no ordinary man. The figure was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were still hollow voids, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. The villagers screamed and fled, but there was no escape. The figure moved with unnatural speed, its long limbs reaching out to snatch at those who tried to run. Ling stood frozen in place, her mind racing as she tried to comprehend what was happening. Just as the figure reached her, a voice rang out through the night. It was her grandmother, awake and alert, her voice strong and commanding. She called out the figure's name, and it stopped in its tracks, turning its empty gaze toward her. The figure seemed to hesitate, its movements slowing as it was drawn toward Ling's grandmother. The old woman began to chant in a language Ling did not recognize, her voice rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern. The figure wavered, its form flickering like a shadow in the wind. And then, with a final, ear-piercing scream, the figure disintegrated into a cloud of black smoke, which was quickly carried away by the wind. The fire died down, and the village was plunged into an eerie silence. The villagers slowly returned, their faces pale with fear. They gathered around Ling's grandmother, who had collapsed onto the ground, exhausted from the effort. Ling rushed to her side, but her grandmother's breathing was shallow, and her eyes were closed. "She saved us," the high priest whispered, his voice trembling. She knew the ancient words, the words to banish the spirit. But as Ling looked down at her grandmother, she knew that this was not the end. The spirit had been banished, but the darkness that had been unleashed on the village would not be so easily contained. Chapter 3: The Haunted. The days following the ritual were tense and filled with unease. The villagers were on edge, wary of any sign that the darkness might return. Ling stayed by her grandmother's side, praying for her recovery, but the old woman remained unconscious, her life hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, strange things continued to happen in the village. People reported seeing shadows moving in the corners of their vision, hearing voices whispering in the dark, and feeling an oppressive weight in the air. The villagers avoided going out after dark, and the once lively streets were now eerily silent at night. One evening, Ling decided to visit the temple to pray for her grandmother's recovery. As she walked through the deserted streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. When she arrived at the temple, she found it empty, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. She knelt before the altar and closed her eyes, trying to focus on her prayers. But as she did, she heard a faint sound behind her, like the rustling of fabric. Ling turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. At first, she saw nothing, but then a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was a woman, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She wore a traditional robe, the fabric torn and stained with what looked like dried blood. The woman smiled, but it was a cold, cruel smile that sent a shiver down Ling's spine. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said, her voice low and raspy. "The spirits are angry, they will come for you." Ling backed away, her heart racing. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The woman tilted her head, her smile widening. "I am one of the forgotten," she replied. "One of the many who were left behind when the living moved on. We were abandoned, forsaken, and now we hunger." Ling felt a cold chill run through her as the woman's words sank in. This was no ordinary spirit. This was a hungry ghost, a soul condemned to an eternity of suffering. And now, it was here, in the village, seeking revenge. The woman stepped closer, her eyes locked on Ling's. "You cannot escape," she whispered. "The darkness will consume you all." And then, before Ling could react, the woman lunged at her, her hands reaching out to grab her throat. Ling screamed and scrambled back, but the woman's grip was like iron, her fingers cold and unyielding. Just as Ling thought she would be strangled, the door to the temple burst open, and a group of villagers rushed in. They pulled the woman off Ling and restrained her, but as they did, the woman's form flickered and faded, like a wisp of smoke in the wind. The villagers exchanged fearful glances, their faces pale. "The spirits are growing stronger," one of them murmured. "We must do something before it's too late." But Ling knew that it was already too late. The darkness had taken hold of the village, and it would not let go. Chapter 4: The Descent. As the days passed, the situation in the village grew worse. More and more people reported strange sightings and experiences, and the fear that had gripped the villagers now threatened to turn into full-blown panic. The elders met in secret, trying to come up with a plan to deal with the growing threat, but nothing they tried seemed to work. Ling's grandmother remained in a coma, her condition deteriorating. Ling spent every moment by her side, desperate to find a way to save her. But as the nights grew darker, and the shadows grew longer, she began to lose hope. One night, as she sat by her grandmother's bedside, she heard a voice whispering in her ear. It was soft and distant, like the wind, but the words were clear. "Come to the forest," the voice said. "Come to the place where it all began." Ling felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The forest was a forbidden place, a place where no one went after dark. It was said to be haunted by the spirits of those who had died in the village, their souls unable to find peace. But now, it seemed that the forest was calling to her, drawing her in. She hesitated for a moment, but then, with a deep breath, she made up her mind. If there was any chance of saving her grandmother and the village, she had to go. Ling left the house and made her way to the edge of the forest. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. The air was cold and still, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under her feet. As she entered the forest, the darkness closed in around her, swallowing her whole. She walked for what felt like hours, the trees pressing in on all sides, until she came to a clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old, crumbling shrine. The stones were covered in moss, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. Ling approached the shrine, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, she saw it, a figure standing in front of the shrine, its back to her. It was tall and thin, its skin pale, and its hair long and black. Ling's breath caught in her throat as the figure turned to face her. It was her grandmother, but there was something wrong. Her grandmother's eyes were cold and empty, and her face was twisted into a cruel smile. She stepped toward Ling, her movements slow and deliberate. "Why did you come here, Ling?" her grandmother asked, her voice low and menacing. "You should have stayed away. Now, you will never leave." Ling backed away, her heart racing. "This isn't real," she whispered. "This can't be real." Her grandmother's smile widened. "Oh, but it is. You see, Ling, this village is cursed. The spirits of the dead are trapped here, unable to move on. And now, you are trapped too." Ling shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she said, her voice trembling. "I won't let this happen. I won't let you keep me here." Her grandmother laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the forest. "It's too late, Ling. You belong to the darkness now." And then, with a sudden burst of speed, her grandmother lunged at her, her hands reaching out to grab her. Ling screamed and turned to run, but the forest was alive, the trees closing in around her, their branches clawing at her as she tried to escape. But no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't outrun the darkness. It swallowed her whole, pulling her down into its depths, until there was nothing left but silence. Chapter 5: The Return. When the villagers found Ling's body the next morning, she was lying at the edge of the forest, her eyes wide open and her face frozen in a mask of terror. They buried her in the village cemetery, but even in death, she found no peace. That night, the villagers heard her voice echoing through the streets, a soft, mournful wail that sent shivers down their spines. They tried to ignore it, to convince themselves that it was just the wind, but the voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was impossible to ignore. The villagers gathered in the temple, their faces pale with fear. The high priest tried to calm them, but his words were drowned out by the sound of Ling's voice, now a chorus of anguished cries. And then, the doors of the temple burst open, and a cold wind swept through the room. The candles flickered and went out, plunging the temple into darkness. The villagers huddled together, their hearts pounding in their chests. And then, in the darkness, they saw them. The spirits of the dead, their faces twisted in anger and pain, their eyes burning with hatred. They swarmed into the temple, their cold hands reaching out to grab the villagers, their voices rising in a deafening wail. The high priest tried to perform a banishing ritual, but his voice was drowned out by the cries of the spirits. The villagers screamed and fled, but there was no escape. The spirits followed them, their cold, clammy hands grabbing at their throats, their breath freezing in their lungs. And as the villagers fell one by one, the darkness closed in, swallowing the village whole. The village was abandoned, left to rot in the shadow of the mountains. The houses crumbled, the streets were overgrown with weeds, and the temple was left in ruins. But the spirits remained, their anger and pain festering in the darkness. And on the 14th night of the 7th lunar month, when the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest, the village comes alive with the sounds of the dead. The voices of the villagers echo through the streets, their cries a reminder of the darkness that consumed them. Those who dare to venture near the village on that night are never seen again, their souls lost to the darkness, their bodies left to rot in the forest. The village is cursed, its history written in blood and shadows, a warning to those who would dare to disturb the peace of the dead. And so, the village remains, a ghost town haunted by the spirits of the past, a place where the darkness never fades, and the dead never rest. The end of the 4th story. 5th story, The Phantom Stage. Chapter 1, The Arrival. The 7th month had arrived, and with it, the air grew thick with the smell of burning paper offerings and the distant echoes of chanting. The streets of Singapore buzzed with quiet anticipation, as people prepared for the Hungry Ghost Festival. During this time, the living coexisted with the dead, and the boundary between the two worlds was at its thinnest. At the heart of this ghostly celebration was a tradition that sent shivers down the spines of those brave enough to attend, the opera show for the dead. These performances, held in open spaces or near temples, were not just for the living but for the spirits who roamed freely during this month. It was said that the first few rows of seats were reserved for the ghosts, and only the foolish or the ignorant would dare sit there. Cheng Wei, a middle-aged man with a penchant for old traditions, found himself drawn to the opera shows every year. The year before, he had experienced something strange, an encounter with a shadowy figure that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Despite his unease, or perhaps because of it, he felt compelled to return. This year, the opera was to be held at an old, decrepit stage on the outskirts of the city, a place where the trees grew thick and the air was still. Cheng Wei arrived just as dusk began to settle, casting long shadows across the ground. The stage, a fragile structure of bamboo and cloth, stood ominously against the darkening sky. The crowd was sparse, mostly elderly folks who had grown up with these traditions. Cheng Wei noticed a few younger faces, but they seemed nervous, glancing around as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows. The stage was brightly lit, but the surrounding area was dark, with only the flickering glow of incense sticks providing some semblance of light. As the opera troupe began to set up, Cheng Wei found a seat near the middle, far enough from the stage to avoid the first rows, but close enough to see the expressions on the performers' faces. The air was thick with anticipation, and as the night deepened, the first notes of the opera began to play. Chapter 2, The Show Begins. The opera started with a slow, mournful tune, the kind that sent chills down your spine. The performers, dressed in elaborate costumes, moved with a grace that belied the eerie setting. Their faces were painted white, with red accents around their eyes and mouths, giving them a ghostly appearance. As they sang, their voices echoed into the night, mixing with the sounds of insects and the occasional rustling of leaves. Cheng Wei felt a cold breeze brush against his neck and shivered. He glanced around, noticing that the first few rows remained empty, save for a few shadowy figures that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. He rubbed his eyes, convinced that it was just a trick of the light, but the unease settled deep within him. As the performance continued, the story unfolded, a tragic tale of love and loss, where the protagonist, a young woman, sought revenge on those who wronged her even after death. The opera's themes of vengeance and the afterlife resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom had come to pay their respects to their own deceased loved ones. But something was different about this performance. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier, and the air around the stage seemed to shimmer with an unnatural energy. The performers moved with a mechanical precision, their eyes glassy and distant, as if they were in a trance. The music grew louder, almost deafening, and the once distant wails of the opera singers now seemed to echo from all directions. Cheng Wei's heart pounded in his chest. He noticed that the shadowy figures in the front rows were no longer just flickers of light. They had taken on a more solid form, their faces obscured by darkness, yet their presence undeniable. The other audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some casting nervous glances at the empty rows, others whispering prayers under their breath. And then, it happened. Chapter 3, The Uninvited Guests. The lead actress, playing the vengeful spirit, let out a blood-curdling scream that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. The lights on the stage flickered, and for a brief moment, the entire area was plunged into darkness. When the lights returned, the shadowy figures in the front rows had multiplied, their forms more distinct, their eyes glowing a sickly yellow. Cheng Wei's breath caught in his throat as he watched one of the figures rise from its seat and glide towards the stage. The actress, still in character, continued her performance, seemingly unaware of the spectre approaching her. The audience was frozen in place, a collective fear gripping them as they watched the scene unfold. The figure reached the edge of the stage and paused. For a moment, it seemed as though time itself had stopped. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement, the figure stepped onto the stage, joining the performers. The actress faltered, her voice wavering as she stared at the new addition to their troupe. The figure, draped in a tattered, ancient robe, began to mimic the actress's movements, its gestures exaggerated and grotesque. Cheng Wei felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The figure was not part of the troupe, he was sure of it. The other performers seemed equally bewildered, their eyes wide with fear as they continued their performance, too terrified to break character. The audience was silent, too shocked to react. The only sound was the eerie melody of the opera, now accompanied by the unsettling presence of the ghostly figure on stage. The tension in the air was palpable, and Cheng Wei could feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on him, as if they were watching, waiting for something. And then, the figure turned to face the audience. Chapter 4, The Thin Veil. As the figure's gaze swept across the crowd, Cheng Wei felt an icy chill crawl down his spine. The figure's face, once obscured by shadows, was now visible. A twisted mask of anguish and rage, its features contorted in a horrifying expression. Its eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, seemed to pierce through each member of the audience, locking onto their souls. Cheng Wei tried to avert his gaze, but he found himself unable to look away. The figure's presence was overwhelming, its anger and sorrow palpable. It was as if the spirit had been drawn to the opera, seeking something, perhaps vengeance, perhaps solace, but finding only torment. The figure began to speak, its voice a low, guttural whisper that echoed through the night. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone was unmistakable, a curse, a lamentation, a cry for justice. The other performers, now fully aware of the spectre's presence, recoiled in fear, their carefully rehearsed movements faltering as they struggled to maintain their composure. The audience, too, was gripped by terror. Some tried to flee, but their legs refused to move, as if they were rooted to the spot by some unseen force. Others whispered prayers, clutching talismans and amulets in a desperate attempt to ward off the evil that had descended upon them. Cheng Wei could feel the weight of the spirit's gaze on him, its eyes burning into his very soul. He knew he should leave, that he should run as far away from this cursed place as possible, but something kept him there, something stronger than fear, curiosity, perhaps, or a morbid fascination with the unknown. As the figure continued to speak, the lights on the stage flickered once more, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay. The boundary between the living and the dead was thinning, and Cheng Wei could sense the presence of other spirits, drawn to the opera like moths to a flame. The stage had become a portal, a gateway to the other side, and the spirits were crossing over. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the figure fell silent. The opera came to an abrupt halt, the performers frozen in place, their eyes wide with terror. The figure, now standing at the center of the stage, turned its gaze back to the actress, who was trembling with fear. With a slow, deliberate motion, the figure raised its hand, pointing at the actress. The gesture was unmistakable, a command, an accusation. The actress's voice faltered, and she took a step back, her face pale and drawn. But the figure did not relent. It stepped forward, closing the distance between them, its eyes locked onto hers. The other performers looked on in horror, too terrified to intervene. The audience, too, was paralyzed with fear, unable to do anything but watch as the figure advanced on the actress. And then, with a sudden, violent movement, the figure reached out and grabbed the actress by the throat. The audience gasped in unison as the actress let out a strangled cry, her body convulsing as the figure tightened its grip. The lights flickered once more, and the air grew thick with the smell of burning incense and decay. The boundary between the living and the dead had been crossed, and the spirits were taking their revenge. Chapter 5: The Curse. The actress struggled against the figure's grip, her eyes wide with terror as she gasped for breath. The other performers were frozen in place, their faces pale with fear as they watched the scene unfold. The audience, too, was paralyzed, unable to move or speak as the figure tightened its grip on the actress's throat. But then, something strange happened. The actress's body went limp, and her eyes rolled back into her head. The figure released her, and she crumpled to the ground, lifeless. For a moment, there was silence. The audience stared in shock at the lifeless body on the stage, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The other performers looked on in horror, their faces twisted in fear and disbelief. But the figure did not stop there. It turned its gaze to the audience, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, and the temperature dropped as the figure began to speak once more. Its voice was a low, guttural whisper that echoed through the night, sending shivers down the spines of everyone present. The words were incomprehensible, but the tone was unmistakable: a curse, a lamentation, a cry for justice. Cheng Wei could feel the weight of the spirit's gaze on him, its eyes burning into his very soul. He knew he should leave, that he should run as far away from this cursed place as possible. But something kept him there, something stronger than fear, curiosity, perhaps, or a morbid fascination with the unknown. As the figure continued to speak, the lights on the stage flickered once more, and the air grew thick with the smell of decay. The boundary between the living and the dead was thinning, and Cheng Wei could sense the presence of other spirits, drawn to the opera like moths to a flame. The figure raised its hand, and the audience felt a wave of cold wash over them. The spirits were crossing over, and they were angry. The figure pointed at Cheng Wei, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. Cheng Wei's heart raced as he felt the weight of the spirit's gaze on him. He tried to move, but his legs refused to cooperate. The figure stepped forward, closing the distance between them, its eyes locked onto his. And then, with a sudden, violent movement, the figure reached out and grabbed Cheng Wei by the throat. The audience gasped in unison as Cheng Wei let out a strangled cry, his body convulsing as the figure tightened its grip. The lights flickered once more, and the air grew thick with the smell of burning incense and decay. The boundary between the living and the dead had been crossed, and the spirits were taking their revenge. Chapter 6: The Aftermath. When the lights finally came back on, the stage was empty. The figure had disappeared, and the bodies of Cheng Wei and the actress lay lifeless on the ground. The other performers were still frozen in place, their faces pale with fear and disbelief. The audience was in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Some whispered prayers, others clutched talismans and amulets in a desperate attempt to ward off the evil that had descended upon them. But it was too late. The curse had been unleashed, and the spirits were taking their revenge. The boundary between the living and the dead had been crossed, and there was no turning back. The opera stage, once a place of entertainment and tradition, had become a portal to the other side, a gateway to the afterlife. And now, the spirits were free to roam, seeking vengeance on those who had wronged them. As the crowd slowly dispersed, the air was thick with the smell of decay and burning incense. The spirits had been appeased, but at a terrible cost. The opera show for the dead had become a nightmare, and the people of Singapore would never forget the horror they had witnessed that night. Epilogue. The next day, the opera stage was dismantled, and the area was cleared. But the memory of that night lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The story of the cursed opera spread like wildfire, and soon, no one dared to attend such performances during the Hungry Ghost Festival. The spirits had claimed their due, and the people of Singapore learned to tread carefully during the 7th month. The line between the living and the dead was thin, and sometimes, it was better not to disturb it. But every year, as the Hungry Ghost Festival approached, the memory of that night would resurface, and the people would remember the terror of the opera show for the dead, a reminder that some things are better left undisturbed. and that the spirits are never truly at rest. The end of the fifth story. Sixth story, The Night of the Hungry Ghosts. In the remote village of Guijie, nestled deep within the mountainous region of southern China, the 15th day of the 7th lunar month was a day that everyone both revered and feared. Known as the Zhongyuan Festival, or the Hungry Ghost Festival, this ancient tradition held a special significance in the village, where the boundaries between the living and the dead were believed to blur. As dusk fell, the village was transformed. The normally quiet streets were lined with lanterns, their flickering lights casting eerie shadows that danced in the wind. The villagers, dressed in traditional attire, gathered in the central square to pay homage to their ancestors. Offerings of food, paper money, and incense were meticulously arranged, their scents mingling in the cool night air. Among the villagers was a young man named Zhonghao, who had recently returned to Guijie after years of working in the city. He had always been skeptical of the old traditions, considering them superstitious relics of a bygone era. However, his skepticism was challenged that fateful night. The festival began with the sound of gongs and chanting. Monks from a nearby monastery had come to lead the rituals, their deep voices resonating through the village. Zhonghao watched from the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed and a skeptical smirk on his face. But as the night wore on, a sense of unease began to creep over him. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally. He noticed that some villagers were whispering among themselves, their eyes darting nervously around. It was then that he overheard an old woman speaking in hushed tones about the legend of Mulian, the disciple who had descended into hell to save his mother. Curiosity piqued, Zhonghao approached the old woman, who was known as Granny Lin. She was a repository of village lore, and had lived through more hungry ghost festivals than anyone else in Guijie. When he asked her about the story, she fixed him with a piercing gaze. Mulian's tale is a warning, she said. It reminds us that the spirits of the dead are not to be trifled with. On this night, the gates of hell open, and the hungry ghosts roam free. We must appease them, or they may take their vengeance upon us. As Granny Lin spoke, a sudden chill ran down Zhonghao's spine. He tried to shake it off, but an inexplicable dread settled in his heart. He decided to stay close to the main gathering, where the light and company of others could offer some comfort. However, as midnight approached, the village square began to empty. Families returned to their homes, leaving their offerings behind. Zhonghao found himself almost alone, save for a few stragglers. He watched as the monks performed the final rites, their chants growing softer and more haunting. Just as the last monk extinguished his lantern, a gust of wind swept through the square, snuffing out the remaining lights. The village was plunged into darkness. Zhonghao felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Granny Lin, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "They are here," she whispered, "the hungry ghosts." Before Zhonghao could respond, the ground beneath them began to tremble. Shadows coalesced into grotesque shapes, and the air was filled with an unearthly wailing. The offerings left for the spirits began to smolder and burn, their smoke forming ghostly figures that hovered in the air. Panicking, Zhonghao grabbed Granny Lin's hand and tried to lead her away, but the village seemed to have transformed into a labyrinth. No matter which direction they turned, they encountered apparitions of the dead. Some were withered and skeletal, others bore the marks of violent deaths, their eyes empty and accusing. In the midst of the chaos, Zhonghao remembered the story of Mulian and the importance of offerings. He quickly gathered some of the remaining food and incense, frantically arranging them in a desperate attempt to appease the spirits. As he lit the incense and bowed his head in prayer, the wailing grew louder, then suddenly ceased. When Zhonghao dared to lift his head, he saw that the ghostly figures had receded, their forms dissolving into the night. The air was still and silent, save for the distant sound of a gong. He helped Granny Lin to her feet, both of them trembling with relief. "You have done well," she said, her voice shaking. "But remember, the hungry ghosts are never truly gone. They will return next year, and the year after that. We must always be vigilant." Zhonghao nodded, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily upon him. He had come face to face with the supernatural, and his skepticism had been shattered. As he walked Granny Lin back to her home, he vowed to respect the old traditions and to honor the spirits of the dead. The next day, the village of Guijie seemed to return to normal, but Zhonghao knew that things would never be the same for him. The memory of that night haunted him, a constant reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead. And every year, when the 15th day of the 7th lunar month approached, he would prepare his offerings with reverence and fear, knowing that the hungry ghosts would once again walk among them. The story of Zhong Hao and the Hungry Ghost Festival became a part of village lore, a chilling tale that was told and retold to warn future generations. And so, the legacy of Mu Lian and the Hungry Ghosts lived on, a testament to the enduring power of ancient traditions and the mysteries of the unseen world. The end.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. If you enjoyed our exploration of ghosts, mythical creatures, and urban legends, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling episodes. Until next time, my beloved listeners.